Today is March 27th, 2024, and my guest is psychologist Paul Bloom of the University of Toronto. His Substack is called Small Potatoes, and I love it. This is Paul's sixth appearance on EconTalk. He was last here in December of 2023 talking about whether artificial intelligence can be moral. Paul, welcome back to EconTalk.
Glad to be back. Thanks for having me.
I want to let listeners know this episode may touch on some adult or dark themes. You may want to listen in advance before sharing with children. And our topic for today is a recent essay on your Substack. The title was Be Right Back, which described a scenario for the future, a scenario I would call a certain kind of immortality that you, Paul, called a blessing and an abomination, which I thought was the perfect framing of what is perhaps, I think almost certainly coming for us in the afterlife that we're about to experience. What is that, Paul?
I like the terms abomination and blessing. There's a nice sort of biblical resonance to them. And what I'm imagining is a world in which artificial intelligence is capable of mimicking real people. And there's all sorts of usages you could imagine this having. I think a lot of people would enjoy having celebrities in their house they could interact with on their phones or on their Alexa system, and I think people would enjoy connecting to friends of theirs, family members who are out of town, who in the middle of the night you wake up, you want to talk to your wife or your husband, they're asleep, so you just kind of just start talking to the simulation. I'm most interested in and most troubled by, and I think we're going to talk about this a bit, in cases where these AI simulations are people who have died. And my inspiration for this, my inspiration for the title of the Substack, Be Right Back, is a Black Mirror episode. And you and I talked about this. We don't want to have spoilers for the episode. People should just, if they have Netflix, they could watch it. But the setup for this is a young woman's husband just dies suddenly. And in this sort of alternative future, she has the ability to have a simulation of him created. And it ends up with, and this, I'm not telling you more than what's in the trailer, but it ends up with the simulation being a robot version of him, which is indistinguishable from the original. But the part I was most interested in, because it's most plausible, is the simulation is just online. So they upload all the videos of him, everything he's written, everything he's commented on, all his DMs and texts and so on. It established his personality that way. And then she could talk to him over the phone. And she finds this at first, she greets this possibility when it's raised to her with horror and disgust, the hallmarks of an abomination. But later she finds it addictive, tremendously moving, powerful. And it takes away some of her grief. And I wanted to, since this does not seem tremendously futuristic, it seems we're close in certain ways, I wanted to talk about what that would be like and the implications.
It reminds me, I've not seen the Dark Mirror episode, but I think it's nice because Dark Mirror is, in theory, I suppose, a science fiction series. We're very close to living in a science fiction world rather than imagining it or reading it. There's a movie I love, or at least I loved a long time ago when I saw it, called Starman. And again, there's spoilers coming. It's about a young widow who's mourning her husband. And I think the movie opens with her drinking a glass of wine late at night, watching home movies of her husband, who's gone, who's died young, tragically. And she's drunk because she can't deal with this loss. And a alien creature slips in through a window. It comes in like a star beam, beam of light, goes through a family album and finds a lock of his hair, I think is what this creature finds. And within a very short period of time, the widow finds herself in the presence of a perfect cloned DNA replica of her husband, but of course without his memories. It's a twist on the Dark Mirror version. She is, of course, deeply attracted to, this is not a robot, though. It's a flesh and blood creature. It looks just like her husband, and we watch as she and this clone get to know each other, although the clone's motive is not the same as hers. The clone is there on a mission from outer space. So you can watch that if you want, but the power of that movie, and I think the power of Black Mirror, and what we're going to talk about today is, as human beings, our finitude, our mortality is unbearable. And religion provides, or used to, I think, much more effectively, some solace for that with the idea of an afterlife, a reuniting. How many movies are there that exploit this human urge? One of my favorites is Heaven Can Wait, which is a magnificent, I love that movie. But there's, I think it's called Clearly, Sadly, Deeply. That movie was so powerful. Alan Rickman's the star of it. I watched it once and I can't watch it again. It's a masterpiece.
Yeah.
It's too sad. So as human beings, we cannot cope with our mortality. We long for immortality. And as human beings, we do it in many different ways. Our children, our books, the memories of the people who are alive when we go. But this is a different level, and it's different.
So there are two questions I could ask you about this, both personal. But the first is too sad, and I won't even ask it, which is, would you want this of the people you love now if you were to lose them? And I mean, honestly, when you lose them, because we all lose people, what would you think of such a substitute? But I'll ask you a different question, which is, if I go online, I could see hours and hours and hours of conversation with you and video with you, more than just about anybody I know. So imagine, and it's not crazy, we upload all of that and we could have a Russ Roberts simulation. And it would be a little bit, it wouldn't be the way you would normally talk to your family and so on. It's a little bit more talking to people about intellectual matters, but there's a lot of stuff there. And it'd be a pretty good simulation. Would you participate in creating one for when you die, for the people you leave behind?
Can I answer the first one also?
Yeah, definitely.
One of the things I love about having Paul Bloom as a guest is that he sometimes asks questions, which means I get to be the guest, which I appreciate. Lonely here as the host for 940
I take
episodes.
away some of the responsibility.
What?
I take away some of the responsibility.
Exactly.
I should get a share of the revenues from this episode.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that.
Yeah. The first question, I think, is a very profound question, obviously. And what's beautiful about your essay is it's a speculation about what might be coming quite soon, actually. But it forces you to think about life, not just simulations and death. I lost my father about 4 years ago. I was very close to him. And I had dreaded that day for a long, long time. I was so close to him when I was younger. I was afraid much more of his death, obviously, than my own, but just worried that I would struggle to cope with a world without my dad. And when he got older and sick and lost some of his mental capability, I was surprised after his death how little I missed him. I still miss him, but I thought it would be much stronger. And part of the reason I didn't miss him as much as I expected is that when he died, he wasn't the same person he was when he was younger. I didn't miss the man who passed away at 89 years old. I missed the man who was the 50-year-old, or even better, the 40-year-old father of me as a young boy or as a young man, who I turned to, who I wanted his approval, and so on. And so if you said to me, would you want a recreation of your father? I would say, yeah, but not the one at the end. Don't use all the data. And you give this example about tweaking the avatar, the simulation. I want the 40 to 58-year-old dad of mine who was funny and wise and treated me a certain way differently than he did at the end, the last, say, 5 to 10 years of his life. So that's the first thought I have about that. The second question is, people have already done what you're talking about. They've uploaded transcripts from podcasts or writing of people. And at the current level, it's not very good.
No, it's not good at all.
I can have a conversation with Adam Smith based on his books that are online, and it's disappointing. It's not very, very interesting, but it will get better. In fact, it will get better and better and better. And the idea of whether you pose the incredibly creepy, but I think inevitable dilemma, how much of my life would I spend preparing for others to enjoy this? How much of my own day-to-day life would I record so that my loved ones, when I'm gone, or strangers, forget my loved ones, that strangers could enjoy my character, my persona. And I'm not sure it's an abomination, but it's a creepy thought. What are your thoughts on those two issues?
It wouldn't be, I don't see it as much work, actually. I can imagine us just like carrying around an obtrusive recorder as we go about our lives and talk to our children and our partners and our friends. Sort of like a podcast, living one's life as a podcast, but just collecting a lot of data. And I mean, there are two questions. The second question, would I participate in leaving something behind? If I felt the people who are close to me would want that, I see some negatives. I could see it. I'm most sort of troubled and curious about children, about young children. I have older children who are out in the world, and maybe they would enjoy being able to sort of go onto a computer, have a little conversation with the version of me once I've passed. But imagine a child whose mother or father has died at age 5 or 10. I tell the story in the Substack of my own. I don't tell this. It's the first time I've ever talked about this, but my mother died when I was 10. And I was extremely close to her, and I think I would have wanted a simulator to hear her voice again. And I'm old enough so that for her, there weren't I couldn't get a QuickTime movie. There was not all of the video that all of us leave behind now. So I've never heard her voice again once I had my last conversation with her. But would it have been good for me? Would it have sort of blocked the grieving process in some way? Suppose my wife dies, and I have a simulation of her that I just enjoy talking to, have the same conversation. She knows me. The simulation knows me, or appears to know me as well as my wife does. Would I ever seek anybody else? Or would I just spend my time talking to her? And I don't know the answer. I think there's sort of two separate questions. What would we want? And then the second question is, what's good for us?
The other thought I had, and I'm going to phrase this about someone else, so that it's funny how it's hard to talk about it with about you or me. Imagine someone who loses their spouse, has the avatar available or created, the chatbot, and again, it could be on your phone. You talk about it like you'd call them, but of course, you'd call them up. They will be hovering in the room with you in 3D hologram form with all the gestures, just like the Starman DNA thing. They'll have the physical features. Again, you'll pick the year that one wants one's spouse to come back from. And
you know what it will have, which we can do already. It'll have the voice.
Yeah.
The voice, not just the voice as if in a mechanical sort of replication, but the same cadences, the same use of vocabulary. I hear you for 10 seconds. I know it's you.
Yeah.
And I could understand intellectually that an AI, even right now, I think there's been famous cases of this, can fake it. So I'm not talking to Russ Roberts. I'm talking to an AI deep fake. But I think that will be so compelling. And in the Black Mirror episode, when she stops sort of messaging him over the computer and he says, I could give you, if you want, you could talk to me. She hears his voice and then breaks down, and is so moved. And watching it, we're moved too. So sorry, I cut you off.
No, that's all right. Well, I was going to say two things. One, one of my children in particular is a superb mimic. And we don't need the avatar if they want to hear me. He can, and he knows all my catchphrases. He knows it better than I do. because he's noticed them. I won't reveal it, but my children have a WhatsApp group named after one of my common phrases. And until I became aware of that, which was, I think, an accident, I'm not in the group, obviously. It's for them to talk about me. Yes. I didn't realize, oh, yeah, I say that a lot. And they've figured that out and made that the name of the group. But what I was going to say about the spouse, and this for me is where it gets particularly interesting and dark. I mean, I heard. Let me introduce my thought on this with a story. I went to a memorial service, and a woman had lost her husband of 70 plus years of marriage.
Wow!
And for reasons not worth going into, I was friendly with both of them, but I was not close friends. And the woman revealed something very personal to me, partly because I think I wasn't a close friend. She said, this memorial service took place sometime after the death of the husband. She said, I talk to him all the time. And I said, of course you do. And she said, my friends think I should stop doing that. I should get over it. And I said, I don't think so. I think it would be weird if you didn't talk to him. You talked to him for 70 years. Why would you stop? But what I'm thinking is that's a particular case, people in their 90s. But if, God forbid, if someone lost a spouse fairly young, or certainly in a midlife, and you had that avatar, and you're saying, would that delay you from entering out and dealing with your grief? But there's a second possibility, which is if you then remarried, would you not be tempted and maybe encouraged by your new spouse to continue that relationship? Just like people who break up with their spouses or divorce either or separate from their partners, say, and I'm always, I guess it varies tremendously by the relationship of the person, but they say, oh, we're still friends. And often the person who's the new spouse, the new partner, says, resents that.
Yeah.
Sometimes they encourage it, sometimes they resent it. But imagine if on your watch, one could chat with one's former spouse about their problems, including their problems with their new spouse,
yes,
or new partner, and say, I'm having trouble, because often our relationship with our friends are as an ear, a shoulder to cry on. Anyway, that's coming. I don't think there's any doubt that is coming. But my view is the way I phrased it. You phrased it a different way. I phrased it. And we'll come back to this. I'm not ready to talk about this yet, Paul. But I think the right question is, can we possibly resist this future? Should we? Which is the question I think you were asking. And if we decide that this is not healthy for ourselves, is it possible? I'm not sure it's possible. When I think about the seductiveness of screens and social media, let's move away from spouses. If I have a chance to hang out with Adam Smith, let me give you 3 scenarios and let you react to it. So at the end of my book on Adam Smith, I imagine having a drink with him. And I love that idea, right? So imagine I could conjure up his avatar and have that drink, and we could talk about tariffs. We could talk about why he, at the end of his life, was a customs official. I could find out more about David Hume, right? And this is a world where Adam Smith is more than just the collection of his writings. This is the Adam Smith whose every conversation he's had with David Hume has been recorded and saved. And so I can find out about not just hang out with David Hume. Of course, I guess I could have both of them over, and I could watch their interaction, which would be charming, and I'd get to be their new friend, and so on. So that's one level. Second level is, I say, Paul, I really enjoy talking to you, and it's a shame we only talk every 3 or 4 months. Could we have a Zoom relationship where we have a drink together now and then? And I have a friend I do this with. We have coffee now and then. We don't do it much since I moved to Jerusalem because of the time difference, but I used to talk to him now and then. So that's level 2. So level 1 is a fake, but maybe really real Adam Smith. Hard to describe it as fake if it's absorbed all of his interactions with his friends, his mom, and his writing. Second level is I'm hanging out with you, but it's over Zoom. And I can't smell how smoky your scotch is. The third level is I have a friend here I like to have a l'chaim with now and then. And, maybe he's not as interesting as you, Paul. So instead of seeing him in the flesh, I hang out with Paul Bloom and I hang out with Adam Smith. And eventually, maybe, Paul, I hate to say it, I might also want to hang out with someone else, not just Adam Smith, but you'd slide down the totem pole. I'd hang out with, Michael Jordan, because he'd have an avatar for sale that would let you interact with him. Forget living people. I'd have a whole host of Adam Smith-like extraordinary conversationalists. Dorothy Parker would be in my living room. Samuel Johnson. It would be, why would I ever spend time with you, Paul, over Zoom? And certainly not with, I won't pick a name, but my friend here in Jerusalem, who's not nearly, possibly, but maybe, but could not, maybe can't compete with my online friends. In which case, I'm living a total digital life. Is that appealing to you?
There's a lot there. Sometimes people are given this question, and maybe for dating services and so on. If you could have 3 people over for dinner, who would they be? And I don't know, maybe for you it would be Adam Smith, Dorothy Parker, and your late father. And, you have a great conversation going. Maybe another night you choose another 3, sports or current economists. And well, now we can. Are in the near future, in our lifetimes, maybe we can. And, the part of the seductive part of this and part of why it's worrying is any individual in reality is at times sleepy, impatient, rude, self-centered, uninteresting. Conversations don't always go the way you want it. Maybe I really want your advice on something. I want to tell you something, but maybe you're bored, or maybe you want to tell me something, and you one up me on my story. I didn't want that. I wanted simple. But of course, the AI will be just right, and it could be. There's an analogy here with pornography. There's an analogy here with super sweet foods that our minds have evolved to have certain tastes, through evolution, through culture, to have certain tastes. And we have tastes in people. We're looking for kindness and love and patience and humor. And what if these simulations can do that better than real people can? Where would the draw be of real people? Putting aside the physicality, which maybe AI can't do, but most of my relationships with people are not physical in any way. So I'm perfectly happy just talking to them. And maybe AI does better talking. And it's easy to see this as a dystopia. You lose contact with your friend. Why would you? If you gave the reasons for why would you? Adam Smith is wiser. You could conjure up somebody who's much better. And so in some way that's terrible. But it could also be the end of loneliness. I mean, I'll make the other argument, which is, you and I are, I think, very, very fortunate that we have people who love us and are, to varying extents, enmeshed in communities. You're a university president. You're more enmeshed than I'd want to be. But there are not days and days you go without human contact, without anybody interested in you, talking to you. But there are people not far from either one of us right now who haven't spoken to another person for a long time and are desperate for human interest. And what if AIs could scratch that itch? People mock those who seek out, AI boyfriends and AI girlfriends, but loneliness is awful. There are few psychological torments worse and lonely, and it's possible AI could fix that. And that's the case for.
You write the following. We've touched on this, but I'm going to take a variant on it. How much do we want, this is a quote, how much do we want the simulations to correspond to the people they simulate? A couple is married for 30 years. The husband dies from a long illness, and his widow misses him desperately. They've been taping their interactions for many years. They knew this time would come. So the simulation she later signs up for is excellent. It's like talking with him. Their conversations are an enormous relief. But nobody is perfect. Her husband had his flaws. While he loved her very much, he could be sharply critical. And in his later years, he was forgetful, telling the same stories over and over again. Can she contact the firm that provides the simulation and ask for a few tweaks? End quote. And I reminded a song I've quoted on here before. The song is It Had to Be You. It goes like this. I'm not going to sing it because I have a little trouble with the melody. It's a little bit challenging in parts, so I'm just going to read it. It had to be you. It had to be you. I wandered around and finally found somebody who could make me be true, could make me be blue, and even be glad just to be sad thinking of you. And here's the key part. That was pretty good, though. Some others I've seen might never be mean, might never be cross or try to be boss, but they wouldn't do. For nobody else gave me a thrill. With all your faults, I love you still. It had to be you, wonderful you. It had to be you. So who would add faults to their avatar? Who would not tweak that simulation to take out the obnoxious criticisms of a spouse, the moments of cruelty that probably the person who said them might even regret? They might be happy that the spouse takes them out when they're gone, but they're not human.
No.
Really.
There's an analogy with food, which is we have engineered food that hits all of our buttons,
Yeah.
Sugary sodas and impossibly fatty meat and just lights us up. But sometimes you eat this food and afterwards you don't feel right. And you kind of want real food. You want real food that isn't gussied up and energized. It's when you're a kid, candy is wonderful. And it's hard to eat vegetables. For many kids, they don't want to eat vegetables. There's none of the bang of food, but vegetables can be terrific. And you're making a case for a similar point with people, which is it might be that a perfectly designed avatar of somebody I love, all the flaws removed, would be inhuman, and wouldn't come off right. It might be that to be seen as human, to be appreciated as human, you have to reinsert some flaws, some a little bit of repeating the same story twice, a little bit of a bite at a comment, and then part of you says, "Yeah, this is a person." I wanted to go back to something you said about the widow because I found that a great story. And in my piece, I quote a friend of mine, a developmental psychologist, Paul Harris, and Paul has this wonderful essay on death and how we respond to death. And he points out that a very common picture among developmental psychologists, starting with Bowlby, a great attachment theorist, is that what happens when somebody close to you dies is first you don't believe it, and then you respond with anger and despair and all of these emotions. But it turns out it's more complicated than that. It turns out that studies with adults, with widows actually, there's a big study of widows, finds exactly like the story you told me. Widows very often report continuing conversations with their dead husbands, hearing their dead husband's voices, keeping things that he owned and he used as around them as reminders, having photographs to remind them. And then there was a similar study with children who lost their parents, children who lost their siblings, same thing. They would hear from them, they would talk to them. But if you ask the children, do you understand that your father is really dead? Yeah, of course. Only a tiny minority expressed any doubt. They fully come to grips with the fact these people are gone. And yet, in their minds, they resume a relationship with them. And in some way, then, this AI would just maybe facilitate that. It's like a prop to continue this. Maybe, and you can imagine it having some therapeutic uses that way.
Well, I'm pretty sure my mom still talks to my dad. And like that story I told. And guess what? She doesn't need the avatar.
Yeah.
When you've been married, when they were married 60 or so years, 70 or so, almost 70 years, 69 years, she kind of had the data, she's still in of sound mind, and she doesn't need the simulation to remember not just my dad's catchphrases and favorite things to say, but she can, I'm sure, as I can, have a very good conversation with him in my head. And similarly, my wife, thank God's alive, we talk all the time without her, me and her, because I think of things to say and I think of what she'd say back and so on. That is part of an enduring friendship or marriage. And I think what's troubling about this, and I think we should talk a little bit about the abomination part, because we kind of haven't. We've said it's weird or creepy, but abomination is a very strong word. The abomination part is about the tweaking or the altering and then the relying on. I think it's not just, it'd be kind of cool to ask a question of Adam Smith or to, have watch a video, by the way, of someone who has advice for me. I don't have to conjure up some crazy AI science fiction thing. I turn to dead people all the time. I read their books. It's fine. Nobody thinks it's weird. The weird part, I think, is twofold. It's the tweaking to produce what you want as opposed to the reality that was. And then the second part is living in that world full time. And I think that will be the challenge. Just like junk food is seductive, I think the appeal of digital friends, both romantic, sexual, as well as that'll be much more interesting, I think, than me trying to have a drink with Adam Smith. But I think that that world, that retreat from the human flesh and blood world, is what is creepy, abomination-ish.
Yeah, I agree. I think that there's a couple of things. One is, I don't find anything creepy about an Adam Smith simulation. That's all. It could be intellectually stimulating, all good fun. But imagine somebody whose child dies, let's say a teenage child, and then there's a simulation. He talks to the child and shares stories, talks about, remember when there's something about that which might be repellent, above and beyond any sort of implication it has for the grieving process and for how you spend your life. It might be repellent because this machine is purporting to be somebody who it's not. And even if you have, and I discussed this a bit in the essay, even if it's sort of very careful to say, no, I gotta, you say, remember when and then the simulation comes back and says, I should remind you that although I have the voice of your son, I'm not really him. But even if it does that, there's something, I don't know, unholy about a machine trying to replicate faithfully somebody you love so that you could pretend that they are that person. And then I'll also add just something sort of practical, which is, everyone has observed and is panicking about the extraordinarily addictive powers of the internet and social media and artificial worlds we live in. Jonathan Haidt most recently has a book coming out on the topic, and this just adds to it. Oh, great! Now we have the people we love accessible online, and all of that makes it less likely you'll see your friend or Zoom with your real friend, and more likely you'll just press a button and get it through the computer and get something better.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about this, but of course, it's obvious that it's going to change. We'll be in competition with these creatures, and it will change how we interact. And only the most extraordinary, perhaps, maybe only the most extraordinary people will have real friends. And the less attractive, less charismatic people will be driven to a fully online existence. That's painful. But I want to come back to your word. You want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think here's another way of putting your point, which is it's an issue which sometimes comes up I have an essay with some friends of mine at Toronto on empathic therapy done through AI. And one problem with it is that just like a child who eats, a lot of candy and drinks a lot of sugary soda and then won't go near real food, you could imagine a case where people become used to these perfectly compliant, frictionless, incredibly interested in you, incredibly witty AI simulations. And so real people just are just not, they don't match up. Why would I want a real girlfriend when my AI girlfriend is so interested in me, loves me so much, and has no needs of her own, apparently, above just cares all about me. And what would that do to people?
Yeah. I'm 69, Paul. I forgot how old you are.
I'm 60.
So our 23-year-old listeners, of which there are a few, maybe more than a few, may find this puzzling, this conversation. They're more used to technological comfort than we are. I think there'd be a big age gap in what is considered abominable and what is considered a blessing. But I want to come back to that word unholy, because I think that gets at something you touch on only obliquely in the essay, which is religion. So religion believes, most religions, I think, certainly of the Judeo-Christian ones, believe that you have a soul. There's something divine about your essence. And when you die, something happens to that soul. You don't just decompose as a physical object. You're different from a dog, and you're different from a table. And you have, humanity is maybe crooked timber, but it's not, it has a spark of the divine, certainly in Judaism. And I won't speak for other religions, but most religions deal with some kind of afterlife, some kind of hope for reuniting, and so on. And that worldview has diminished in the West. It's become less appealing. And, we had a conversation a long time ago, which got into my book, ended up in my book, Wild Problems, about whether it's better to be a philosopher or a pig, whether it's better to live the examined life of the philosopher, or to be cavorting and enjoying a physical life. And as religion diminishes, I think it's harder and harder to reclaim anything other than utilitarian physical pleasure. And so you and I, we're older. We come from a different era. We still have in us some unease about some of these scenarios. I think younger people, particularly secular young people, would find some of our unease both baffling and perhaps silly. Life, if you're not religious, life's to be enjoyed. And why wouldn't you spend it with the best possible experiences with those avatars? It goes back to this wonderful idea of Robert Nosx, the experience machine, where you hook yourself up to a machine, you program it, and while you're on the machine, you will think you are the greatest golfer of all time, the president of the United States, the doctor who cures cancer, the rock star who plays before 100,000 people, and so on. You choose whatever you want. And while you're hooked up to the machine, it'll feel like real. And then you die when you finish your life on the machine. And you accomplish nothing. And for those of us, myself, for example, who feel that life has some kind of purpose and that we have things to achieve and growth to experience, these digital alternatives are abominable and creepy. But I think for most people, I don't think it bothers them at all. And when Nosx wrote that experience machine example, which was back in the 70s, I think most people would have been horrified by it. And I'm sure there's data on this. People have asked about this. And I know that in the modern world, meaning now, many more people are willing to do that. They say they would, even though they would do nothing with their life other than lay on a table, but feel like they were doing something. And I think your examples get at that, to interact with a machine, a digital avatar day to day instead of real human beings might be very pleasant. It's like the pig, but it's not the philosopher's life.
I never thought of it that way. I've never connected the idea that being immersed with sort of artificial friends is like being a Nosx experience machine, where you have interactions that ultimately lead to nothing. They're sort of all in your head. They're in your head. Now your head is supplemented by a machine, but it's still all in your head. It's not, you're not really making a connection, not really establishing a relationship, not really changing people's lives. And I think that's a really clever way to put it, and maybe kind of helps us figure out what we might find so disturbing about it. It's an escape from reality. Sure, maybe you're happier, maybe it's more pleasure, maybe it alleviates your loneliness better, but in reality, the person you love is dead, and you should be seeking out, after a certain amount of time when the grieving has ended, more people. In reality, yeah, your AI simulation is fantastic company, but your friend is a flesh and blood person, and connecting to an actual person means so much more. So yeah, I hadn't thought of it that way, but that is one way of establishing the unease I have with this substitute, even if it had no other consequences, even if people were just happier and more satisfied. I'll push back on one thing, and maybe this would take us too far afield, so you just kind of let me ramble and then ignore it. But I'm not sure that sort of kids today are becoming more utilitarian. I think it's complicated. You're certainly right. They are less religious. There's been a decline in the sort of religious belief in an afterlife and so on. That's easily documented. But I think it's interesting. I look at the sort of so-called social justice, so-called woke movement of our time, where you have people in their 20s, your younger listeners will think of the world radically different from you, the way you and I do. But it's not like they're hardcore utilitarians. Rather, they're actually caught up in all sorts of high-level values like diversity and social justice. With regard to sexuality, they tend to be more sharply moralistic than older people. I think probably promiscuity is more acceptable to a 40-year-old than a 20-year-old. And so I just think it's kind of complicated. And my sense is more that our values and the extent to which we are sort of utilitarian as opposed to seeking out higher values really ebbs and flows through history and doesn't simply show us a simpler pattern.
I think I agree with that. It's a great correction. Let me just say a different version of it. After my father died, I went through the traditional Jewish practice of mourning, which is quite complicated and really quite extraordinary, and I'm very grateful for it. But it's a lot of work. It involves saying a certain prayer 3 times a day in the presence of at least 10 men. It's 10 people if you're following a different version of Judaism than I follow, but it's 10 people at least, which means having to interrupt your day at least twice because 2 of the 3 are combined. It involves abstaining from live music if you're Orthodox, as I am, for 11 months. And for 7 days, you sit on the ground and don't do anything except visitors. That's the so-called Shiva, which is a variant on the Hebrew word Sheva, which is 7. And many people like this practice when they're in the presence of it because they see it has a slow, steady, cathartic effect. And the alternative, which I don't mean to pick on, this is not a religious comment, this is just a statement about grieving in general. When Mel Carnahan and his son died tragically in a plane crash while he was campaigning, I think, for the Senate, his wife immediately, within a week, I think a day, began campaigning in his place. His advisors and others encouraged her to, there's higher values than grieving and mourning. You should just, stop, don't think about it or do, but either way, get back to life. This is the equivalent of don't talk to your dead husband. It's better you need to get back to life, get a different kind of life. And an alternative version of that is if you're sad, after you've lost your father, you should take some drugs, get drunk, or take an antidepressant, or get high. Because, I mean, why would you want to suffer? And a religious person is into suffering. Let's be honest. Suffering is at the core of the Judeo-Christian tradition, not necessarily something you seek out, but it is part of the experience of being a human being, is to suffer and to be sad and to deal with that and to learn how to grow from that. And if I can ramble on for one more minute, one of my favorite stories, and if anyone knows the source of this, I'd love to hear it, but I love this story. It sounds like a Hasidic story. I cannot find it. But the story is that the master has a student, and the student comes to the master for wisdom. And the master says, here's a stone, and here's a tower. Your job is to get the stone through the doorway of the tower and climb the stairs and take the stone to the top of the tower. And the student picks up the stone, and he takes it to the door of the tower, and it doesn't fit. Can't get it through the door. He turns the stone, he rotates the stone, nothing. He goes to the master, says, I can't, it's impossible. You've given me an impossible task. And the master takes a hammer and he splits the stone and says, now you can get it through the door. And he says, the stone is your heart, and it must be broken before it can climb and be elevated. And this, this simple end of parable, this simple parable, I think, says something about life. But I understand the alternative, which is, why would you suffer if you could avoid it? And so, the idea that we should endure pain or misery if we have a digital alternative is I understand that view. So while I agree with you that young people are not merely pleasure seekers, even in the absence of religion, of course, they look for purpose. We're human beings. Human beings want to belong. We want to have a reason to live. People who pursue pleasure in a utilitarian way tend not to be very happy, although they may have a lot of pleasure. At least that's my religious bias. I don't know if it's backed up by the data. You'll tell me, Paul. But I understand that I think as religion, if it does die out, seeking pleasure will become maybe more attractive. And at the same time, I agree with you. There could be a pendulum swing back toward a search for meaning when these pleasures of digital simplicity maybe are not so appealing after all.
Yeah. I know better than to try to throw some happiness data at you. We've talked before. I know your skepticism, and I share some of it. So I'm not gonna try. I agree with your defense of grief. I think that there's two defenses of grief, and also the sort of the structures that religions like Judaism have set up in order to allow us to experience grief. And I think there's a genius. At least I'm also most familiar with the Jewish way of doing things, and there's a genius to it. It's titrated. It's titrated to the rituals you experience would be for your father, but not for your second cousin. Yeah. They are for a week, but then for a month they're lessened, but they're not. They don't go away. There's all sorts of restrictions, and then for a year. But then after a year, it's over. And the assumption is, am I right that after a year?
Well, except it's never over for Judaism.
Never
after
over.
A year, and I'm glad you made that point, that it slowly ebbs, which mimics, of course, your own mourning and grief. But after, the most intense is that year. But then, and after that year is over, it's actually 11 months. Annually, you observe the death date of the parent. It's called the Yahrzeit, and you light a candle. You go back into synagogue to find a group of 10 people to say the prayer of mourning. That mourning prayer, by the way, is called Kaddish, which people have heard of for a variety of reasons. But I can't help but mention that Kaddish prayer is an exaltation of the divine. It is not anything remotely like what you think would be your duty to say in the face of death. That's a longer story. We'll put that aside. But yeah, it's titrated for the kind of person who passes away, and it certainly is over time changes.
I think that there's two defenses of grief. One is a sort of cold-blooded, almost secular version that is better for you. It's psychologically better for you if you grieve, as opposed to try to rush away and live your regular life. But I think there's more. There's a different kind of defense, which I could imagine you'd be sympathetic to, which is it's a matter of proper respect for those who have died. It's respect for your love for them, respect for them. If after my wife died, the next day I went dancing, you would think, even if it turned out to be psychologically better for you, for me, I was a psychologist. Oh, this is great. This will help him recover. He'll be so much happier. At least I feel, yeah, but that's wrong. You shouldn't do that. Somebody you love. What kind of character do you have? What kind of relationship did you have with this person that you could dance afterwards? And I share the idea that suffering and struggle is an important part of life. I wrote a book called The Sweet Spot, which was all about that theme. But I also, and I think you do too, say, yeah, but pleasure also matters. I wouldn't take somebody, suppose there's somebody and say he is 70 years old, he has no family and no friends, and he's desperately lonely. And maybe for reasons having to do with his character or his social position, he's not in a position to get friends. Maybe he's a difficult person, but he's lonely. And now we have on offer good company for him, good, caring, loving company, simulation. What is it for you and me to say, oh, no, that's an abomination. Stay clear. You can't find real people, find nobody. If he's dying of thirst and all there is sugary soda, he should indulge.
Well, part of me likes that, but part of me says, that's my uncle. And if I can pass him off to a charming, beautiful, young avatar that entertains him in various ways, I won't bother. I don't have to bother visiting him in the old age home or in his apartment, which doesn't smell the way I like things to smell, and it's the decoration, the decor of it is tawdry and out of date, and it just depresses me to go visit him. So that's part of the reason he doesn't have any friends, is that we haven't risen to the occasion of seeing him.
No, I hadn't thought of that. That is true. That is true. In that once there are substitutes for friendship, for companionship, it lessens the moral obligation we would have to reach out to people in need. And I would say sometimes the cost-benefit analysis there goes, yeah, but it's still better to provide it, because maybe you wouldn't have seen your uncle that much. So now you see him once a year instead of once a month. But he's still very lonely when nobody's around. So this will make a difference for him.
Fair enough.
I think we agree on this. Both sets of values are on the table. There's a certain way in which these AI substitutes are wrong, and they're wrong in the same way that plugging yourself into a Nosx experience machine or injecting a tube of constant stream of heroin into your system and living your life like that, in a way that's wrong. But there's also ways in which that this could sort of help alleviate a lot of human pain.
I agree with that.
I guess maybe if I had to sort of sum up a policy recommendation, I would say people who are in a position to live good lives, they're young, they're out in the world, there's nothing horribly wrong with them, they shouldn't succumb to these substitutes. They should try to go in the real world. But people on the periphery maybe would benefit from these substitutes.
I like that. I'm reminded of both mom and dad would have, my dad when he was alive and my mom still will call me for a question. And my first thought, I get frustrated at that. I used to, because I'd say to myself, but can't you Google it? I mean, come on, why are you asking me this? It's ridiculous. And then I realized at some point that they're not calling to get the answer. They're calling to talk to me. And they don't want the avatar. They want me. And
they wouldn't be happy if you brought over to their house one day a box that said Russ Roberts' son in the big print they have. And they have a single big button, which they make for the elderly. You got to push the button. And then you would say, oh, hi, what could I do? I'm here to help, and they wouldn't be happy with that.
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah. So we've been talking about, loved ones, maybe a celebrity. In the old days, your friends and potential romantic partners were the people you ran into at work or at play. Now you have the internet. You can, in theory, it's much better. You're not limited to the people who live near you. You can find people anywhere you want, as long as they're on the app. And it's soon going to be maybe a choice among not just every living person who has access to the internet, but any person who's ever lived as your best bud. Could we resist that? We're back to my question, the question I raised earlier. You're suggesting that talented young people should resist it, but could they? And then I want to go back to should. You said wrong, which surprised me. I would have thought you just said unhealthy. It strikes you as wrong?
Yeah, I could be moralistic. I'm comfortable with that. I think for some of us, we should resist it, just like we shouldn't always drink sugary sodas, just like we shouldn't, hide away and the equivalent to Nosx experience machine is probably ordering a pizza on Uber Eats and watching Netflix. And the time goes by quickly, and it's, there's a certain pleasure to it. And I think that's fine for your occasional evening. Do it all the time where that defines your life. And not only is it kind of bad for you in the long run, but it's wrong. It's squandering away your limited time on Earth where you could be connecting to people and making the world better, and even in the small ways of causing another person pleasure and amusement and human connection. Could we resist it? Your mileage may vary. There are people there. I know people who are off social media. I think people, all the distractions. Some people, my older son, and in a world full of online material, my older son reads books. He once took a summer and read Russian literature. He doesn't even like to read on iPad. He has a Washington D.C. apartment which is filled with books. And so some people can, and some people, and I got to admit, I'm one of them. Are somewhat addicted more than I'd want to be to the internet. So right now, sometimes I wake up 2 a.m. and I can't get back to sleep, and there's my phone, and I do a bit of scrolling, and before you know it, it's 4 a.m. because the algorithms, particularly on Facebook, are so powerful. It knows exactly what I want. I watch endless clips of Kay and Peele and Little Sopranos, and it knows what I like, and there I go, 2 hours gone. And I feel ashamed of myself and angry at myself, and so I'm vulnerable to this. But then there are people who are less vulnerable, and I think there's a really hard problem, the sort of problem that I think you're very interested in. To what extent should we say, well, let people do what they want; they'll make their choices, and to what extent should the state come in and say this has to be regulated because people are not capable of choosing properly, and it's destroying people's lives? So, and one way to make the division, for instance, and this brings us back to John Haidt, is to say children should operate under different rules than adults. We can be paternalistic towards children for obvious reasons. And so you could say under 17, no simulations for you. Okay, fine. There's a little nanny simulation for when we're out of town. But besides that, and you can have your Adam Smith, but you're not allowed to have your pop stars, and no Britney Spears for you, no Taylor Swift for you. But then when you're an adult, you do what you want.
Yeah, I don't. It won't surprise you. I'm not comfortable with it, even as though I think this is unhealthy potentially for some and healthy for others. I don't want the state involved, but for children, I think you're right. The irony is that we've given our children at younger and younger ages over the last 10 years access to all of what the internet has to offer because of social pressure. To do otherwise is to be cruel to your children. They're cut off from so many other the good parts of of the online experience. So we let them get the whole package. I want to add two things from recent episodes that get your reaction to. We talked with Brian Klaas about, I think it's Nietzsche's idea, or I don't know if Nietzsche talks about it, I don't know if other people, if it's his idea, but this idea of amor fati, of loving one's fate. And loving one's fate means you embrace everything that's happened to you, the good and the bad. And of course, that's a different way of saying that the experience machine is not the right way to go. But it does, what we're talking about is the fate you love could be very different, because you can hang out with people who only like you, who love you, praise you, whatever you want. By the way, we've assumed everybody would want a perfect spouse, partner. There are many people who would want an imperfect one, I assume, and would want those tweaks to go the other direction. Make it harder for me. I want to suffer.
You think there's many people who would say, "I want my wife to be more critical.
Yeah.
I want my husband to be less attentive."
Yeah. Well, as my I think I've quoted my friend's father before. Until I got married, I was an idiot. Many people actually see benefits to having a spouse they live up to rather than exploit. But what do you think of that idea that there's something in loving one's fate, and that if one could fate, by the way, almost by definition means the things that happen to you that you can't control. And we're talking about it where you control a lot more of the things that happen to you, at least inside.
It's funny you mentioned that episode with Brian Klaas, because I love that episode. And I actually wrote a Substack piece called Clumsy Gods, where I talked about, it's a line from Will McCaskill. And it fits with the theme that all sorts of things we do have these unpredictable consequences. And there's no way we can regulate them. I walk down the street, I distract somebody. There's sort of this tumbling of dominoes in all of our actions, and setting us up for fate that we can't predict. And yeah, I think to some extent there's that. Of course, to some extent, this is always sort of on the one hand, on the other hand, we do want to sort of savor our autonomy and our agency. We want to. It's I think an important part of being a person to say, I'm going to do this. I'm going to affect things, and I'm going to try to establish a certain future for myself and for people I love. But I think you're right that has to be leavened by an understanding that our fate is beyond our control, and maybe we should learn to love the outcome.
And there's a tension between control, our huge human desire, I think, to avoid the uncertainty that we're talking about, and then the joy of serendipity. The unexpected pleasure is, I treasure those so much. All the things that have happened to me that I didn't plan, didn't control, didn't anticipate, and enriched my life, even in a 3-minute conversation.
Yeah, and in some way, it's a problem with our technological pleasures, where they're too consistent, they're too reliable. They give us just what we want. And, I remember I used to love bookstores. And I still do, but not as much. And I just wander around the shelves and see what catches my eye. But now, when I look for books, it's typically through Amazon or something like that. And I kind of know what I want. Or the algorithm tells me what I want, and then I get it. And I probably, on balance, read a lot more books that I like now than when I was 20. But there are fewer surprises. And there's a benefit to surprise.
Yeah, I mentioned this, I think, at some point maybe, that it fascinates me how many authors I have come to love, and this would be true digital or in print, in physical print, who I didn't know of. So you still have plenty of good serendipity, and there's greatness there, and it's hidden below the surface, that if we only stick to the books that are easily and we know about and that everyone loves, everyone recommends, we'll miss some real gems that for us can be transformative.
And to bring it back, these simulations of people will likely give us exactly what we want, and that's partially what's wrong with them.
Yeah, it's true. Two things I just want to mention. I'll just mention one. I just, by chance today, or Omar Fatih, I read a story called The Birthmark by Nathaniel Hawthorne. And it's about exactly what we're talking about. It's about a man who loves his wife except for this really terribly annoying birthmark that for him makes her beauty imperfect. And well, you can imagine what that story is about. It's 4 pages. We'll put a link up to it. Way out of copyright. We can link to it with abandon. I want to close with a reference referencing the conversation I had with Charles Duhigg about conversation. So you and I have never met in person. I joked earlier about interacting with you online. If we lived in the same city, I like to think we would get together now and then. I don't know how often, but now and then. It's a cliche probably, or it should be, that most of our human interactions are rather dull. And Charles Duhigg's book is an attempt to improve our communication with each other. And mindfulness is one way that we can do that. Religion's another way. We see another person being made in the image of God. You're going to treat them in a certain way. But I think the upside of our entire conversation is that I made a remark that this would make this phenomenon we're talking about of simulations would make people compete harder to be more attractive to real other human beings. But it would also create a different kind of conversation, a different kind of interaction with real human beings, maybe much better. So a huge part of our interactions with each other are mediocre in my lifetime. Maybe others are different. You listening at home could tell me otherwise. But I think I'm always struck by how much of our banter and chit-chat with other human beings is merely, you're another human being, I'm another human being. It's nice to see you. Bye. And real conversation, deep, connecting, stimulating, provocative, poetic, moving, it's rare. It's rare here on EconTalk. I've had 940 conversations of an hour plus, and most of them are pretty good, I like to think. And only a handful are extraordinary, which maybe is the way humanity has to be. And maybe none of them are extraordinary to others, but they're extraordinary to me, which is the only point I'm making. And I like the idea. I like to think that if we had these online options, which, by the way, we've assumed are going to work perfectly.
Yeah.
they may get better, but they may ultimately have certain flaws, like a glitch where they repeat, certain things over and over again. We're talking about human beings who repeat stories. They may have technological challenges.
Or they may interject every 5 minutes with, and now a commercial for better health, and something like that.
But I like the idea that maybe this would make our human interactions so much more intense and so much more precious. And maybe we would think longer and harder about how to make that so. So that's my optimistic take on your piece.
I like that. So having talked with these infinitely charming, intelligent simulations, we up our game regarding people. We say this is how it could be done. I like that idea. It's a very optimistic take. So instead of always eating sugary, fatty foods, we say, wow, food could be tasty. Let's try to do that with real food. And I like that idea. I will, however, just put in a plug for mediocre conversations. So I have 3 regular commitments in my life for Zoom conversations with friends. 2 of them weekly, both for an hour, sort of scheduled, and with good friends who are far away. 1 monthly, and I enjoy them. But I'm curious what you find is. So I find Zoom conversations wearying for all sorts of ways. One is you just spend an hour, and those conversations an hour, staring into somebody's face, talking, and it's great. I think they're far more deeper conversations than I would otherwise have. But recently, I was with a friend, and we went to a coffee shop together, and we gossip. We didn't look in the other face. Sometimes we just sit and stare out and look at other things, and it was so much more human. And part of what made it human was so much was mediocre. We didn't say anything. We just kind of, made small talk and joked about things. But the lack of purposeful intensity just made it more human, more social.
Yeah, I don't mean to suggest that you have to talk about Nietzsche every time you have an interaction, or maybe Kierkegaard with the
Maybe
stranger,
Kierkegaard.
or Isaiah, the book of Isaiah. I don't think that's a fair point. Much of our interactions with our loved ones are um, formulaic, and they're the better for it because there's a
Yeah.
comfort there.
Yeah. I remember, again, my older son was young. He would, he in the evenings, he would knock on my study door. The rest of my family would go to sleep early. We were both night owls, so he'd knock on my study door. I would come downstairs with him to the kitchen. He'd make himself a bowl of cereal. He'd just done his homework. I'd pour myself a whiskey, and he'd just talk to me. And I wouldn't say very much. He'd talk to me about his ideas and everything. And we did this, it was like a year. We did this pretty regularly. And I really cherished that time, though sometimes watching that's not much of a conversation. But and
It's heaven.
and
It's
so
heaven.
I would, yeah, and I leave a space for that. But I also agree with you and Duhigg, which is too much of our I've had conversations where it's an interesting question why it's so hard to make a conversation with somebody serious and deep. It's so much safer to talk about superficial topics and not say, ask a question like, what do you think of your job? Like, are you happy? Are you happy about what your choices you made? Like, interesting questions. And I find I'm so much to blame because I find it very awkward to do these things. And then maybe it's sort of a moral cowardice that it's just easier to slide by.
And I think it's just hard to pay attention. I mean, I find my failed conversations with the people around me because I'm thinking about what I'm going to have for lunch or what I'm going to do next at the meeting at 2:00, or this little minor success I had that I'm savoring, and I forgot I'm actually talking to you, Paul. Forgive me, but now it's over. You're off to your meeting, and I missed it. I feel like a lot of the times we miss those chances because we don't have the chance, the ability, the skill to focus the way we could if we were better at it.
I really do like your idea that AI interlocutors could help cure us of this, could make us better. Could the interacting with inhuman things could make us more human.
We'll see. I think I said we'll see. I think we will see. My guest today has been Paul Bloom. His Substack is Small Potatoes. Go subscribe. It's excellent all the time. Paul, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Hey, thanks for having me. This was great.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.